Better in Bucharest, it's a podcast about life experiences, leadership lessons, faith, and hope. This podcast will show you that you don't have to compromise your values to achieve happiness.
So my guest for today is Liz Jackson. Liz, it's another friend of mine. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at Ryerson University. She received her Ph.D. from the Department of Philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. Notre Dame is one of the best universities in the world. Her non-philosophical interests include sports, traveling, avocados, coffee, weightlifting, cooking, and podcasts. So, Liz, thank you for accepting my invitation. And tell me, what kind of podcast do you listen to?
Yeah, I actually listen to a big variety of podcasts. So I actually started off podcast listening to kind of more health podcasts. I just interested in health and nutrition. And one thing I really love about podcasts is that it's an easy way to learn a lot about something while you're, like washing the dishes or on a walk or, you're doing something else, but you're still learning. So I listen to a lot of different health podcasts, kind of just about nutrition and exercise. And then I also listen to some podcasts about philosophy and philosophy of religion. So my husband is actually interested in real estate and he's starting a real estate business. So I've been listening to some real estate podcasts as well to sort of learn about what he's been doing. So
we start like every episode with a personal question. And the question is, what was it like around your dinner family table when you were a kid?
That's a great question, because my family is a family of extroverts. We are all very talkative. We are all mostly loud, and we all like to be the center of attention. And so I remember, like, especially kind of when I was in high school, I was the oldest. I have 4 younger siblings. And so everyone was, I think my youngest brother was maybe 9 or something, maybe 8 or 9. And then there's all these ages in between. And we would all just want to tell funny stories to make everyone else laugh, and we're talking over each other. And then my mom would have to say, okay. And she'd try to make order and everyone can go around and have their turn. But I definitely remember lots of talking, lots of laughter, lots of fun. And another thing too that I really loved about my family is we would almost always have people over. So we almost always had other people that would be having meals with us, which I really enjoyed. So it's a little bit sad with COVID. It makes it harder to do a lot of gatherings like that, but we used to do that all the time. So.
And Liz, what did you learn from your mom, from your dad?
Actually, I learned a lot from my mom and dad. My mom, she taught us so many practical things about, everything from cooking to just how to do things in life, which I really appreciate. And one of the most important things I think my mom taught me is how to ask good questions and show an interest in other people. I think that's kind of an underappreciated skill, but it's been wonderful. It just helps you connect with people better and show a genuine interest in the other person, not just make it a conversation about you, which it's funny because you're interviewing me and I'm talking, now we're just all talking about me, but I think it's a very important and valuable skill. I think my dad really instilled in me just a love for the gospel and just seeing the beauty of that. And I think we're going to talk more about this, but just how unique the gospel is to Christianity and how beautiful it is. And don't get me wrong, my mom did too, and my dad taught me a lot about other skills as well. But I really appreciate my parents, and they both taught me so much.
You are an assistant professor at the Department of Philosophy at Ryerson University and an apologist of the Christian faith. But let me ask you, how did you become a believer? What's your story?
Yeah, so like you said, I grew up in a Christian home. Both of my parents are in ministry. I grew up both in the US and then we also did live in Europe. My parents did ministry in Europe and still do ministry in Europe, actually, even though they're now based back in the US. In terms of I think some people have a very exciting testimony where they just clearly have this moment where there's this huge change in their life and they go from unsaved to saved. And, it's almost like Apostle Paul on the road to Damascus, just their eyes are opened, and I think for a while I felt like my story wasn't as good because it wasn't exactly like that, but I think that's the wrong way to think about it. And I think for me, it's been kind of more a story of working out my salvation, like the Bible talks about, rather than this one moment where my life was just drastically changed. But I think, as a kid, I prayed to receive Christ probably several times. Kids do that. And yeah, I don't know if I remember, praying to receive Christ on like a trampoline, but that was probably not the only time I did that. So I guess for me, I think salvation has been kind of a process. But I do think it's notable. In high school, I went on a couple different mission trips. I went to Africa a few times and to Mexico. And I think that was a big turning point for me in my relationship with God. And especially as a kid, I definitely think I had a relationship with God, but it was more, I had all these questions about where everything came from and what's the meaning of life and what caused everything. And God sort of functioned for me as an answer and explanation for the universe more than it was a personal relationship. And through going on some of these mission trips, I think my relationship with God became a much more personal sort of everyday thing rather than this sort of abstract explanation.
Here in Romania, not many people are familiar with this expression, having a relationship with God. Can you tell me more? What do you mean by having a relationship with God?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's really beautiful about it is that we can understand a relationship with God through kind of understanding relationships with other people. And the Bible even talks about how our relationship with God is similar to, I mean, it uses several analogies, but like a parent-child analogy, also a friendship, and then also like a marriage. It uses all of those. And so I think there's aspects of each of those relationships we can use to kind of help understand what it means to be in a relationship with God. But to me, it's like God is someone that I want to know and I want to learn more about. God is someone that I can call on if I need help. And God is someone that I enjoy spending time with. So it's not just a duty that I have or I feel like something I have to do, but it's something I enjoy. So I think when you think about all three of those relationships, there's sort of aspects of what it would be like. In some ways, I see God very much as a father. There's obviously a big asymmetry between myself and God. God is much more powerful, and in that, I think the parent-child analogy plays well. But God is also a friend, someone you can talk to, and someone that you love and who loves you very deeply. And that would be more of kind of the marriage analogy. So I think that's how I think about a relationship with God. God isn't just someone that created the world and then stepped away, but God actually wants to know you, and God wants to hear about things that have gone on in your life, even if God already knows them because God knows everything. So, and I think too, it's really important to realize that it's not just something that has to be a duty that you feel like you have to, you're forced to know God, but you do it because it's what you're made for. It's so fulfilling to know the creator of the universe.
I think many of us, at some point in our life, we have doubts regarding the Christian faith. And for you, when you were in college, what helped you to stay on the path? What helped you to continue, even though you had doubts?
Yeah, I want to say too first about doubt. I think in some Christian circles, they say all doubting is a sin. All doubting is morally wrong. It's bad. Don't doubt. Don't doubt. And I think it's important to realize that there are different kinds of doubts, and I don't think all doubting is a sin. I think sometimes people just have genuine questions. They don't understand, why would God allow evil in the world, or why does God seem far away? Why is God hidden? many, like all the questions I just mentioned too about faith and science and, how does all this fit together? It's confusing. It's hard to understand. I mean, I have a PhD and I feel like I haven't even scratched the surface of a lot of these questions. So the first thing I want to say is like, I want people to feel free to doubt and express those doubts and not just say that's a sin, don't think about that, stick your head in the sand. And even doubting Thomas, it was like, what did Jesus do? He didn't say like, no, I'm not going to give you evidence, just stop asking questions. He actually let Thomas touch his side, and he gave him that physical evidence where he could touch him and see, no, I did rise from the dead. And so I think it's important that we don't just say doubt, sin, don't do it, but we actually really engage doubts and really help people think through the evidence. So that's part of what I want to do as well. So I just wanted to add that. In terms of what has helped me on my spiritual journey, I think, a lot of things. So books, like reading books and podcasts, like I said, of people that are exploring these questions and giving answers, these Christian philosophers. And one thing that the reason I like to do podcasts like this, and I think it's really valuable, and I think it's been cool to see how there has been Christian philosophy in places like YouTube as well, is I think a lot of people aren't going to go and read like an academic journal. But if you're a professional philosopher or a professional academic, that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to publish in an academic journal. And so I think it's really valuable to put the work of people out there in places that aren't just an academic journal, but places that more people can kind of consume and read. So I was actually, this was before YouTube was big when I was in college, but I was actually still watching stuff on YouTube, like philosophy of religion and stuff like that. I remember distinctly doing that with my friends, and reading books. I remember distinctly reading a bunch of Greg Boyd books, but just a lot of books about philosophy of religion and similar topics. And then another big thing for me was we had a philosophy of religion kind of group, but it was mostly Christians. We let everyone come who wanted to, but I think for me, that was a really big part of my faith, is putting myself around people, not just other Christians, but people that were also thinking through these things and were willing to engage me and not just say, stop doubting, that's a sin, or, but people that could really help me lean into my doubts and think through them and think about what the answers might be. And I also had some really great mentors as well in college. Some of them were more academic and some of them were less academic. I think it's also important just to have someone that's, praying with you and looking at the Bible with you and, doing these things that aren't as academic, but are kind of more on a heart level. I think that's super important as well.
Working with students for so many years, I realized that when we speak about the spiritual faith in general, students in a way are a little bit afraid, or they are skeptical, or they have doubts regarding the Christian perspective on life. So what's your advice for this kind of students?
So, I think this actually kind of gets into some of the stuff that is coming up later in the interview too, but one of the biggest themes of my academic work is that a genuine Christian commitment is consistent with doubt. And I think one thing that some people in the church really emphasize today is that it's all about belief and being as confident as possible. And, and sometimes even if you're not 100% confident, you shouldn't really be committed. There's something wrong with being committed, even if you're not 100% confident. The first thing to say is there's not very much we're actually 100% confident of. We can doubt almost anything. This is something that goes way back in the history of philosophy. But Descartes is someone who said, look, you might think there's a computer in front of you. You might think there's a microphone right here. But what if you're dreaming? What if you're in the Matrix? You can even doubt that. You can doubt pretty much anything. So I think the first thing to note is there's very little we're actually 100% certain of. But we still have to go about our day, and we still have to continue with life, and we still have to make these commitments, and I think a commitment to God is a very important one, but there's also similar commitments that I think are of a similar structure, like a marriage commitment, and even more basic, like deciding whether to get on a plane or not. Do you have faith that this plane is going to take you to your destination? And in a lot of these cases, we have to make a choice, even if we're not 100% sure. When you're deciding to get married, you don't know every single fact about the person. You might have a lot of good evidence that they're a good person to marry, but you're not 100% sure. When you're deciding to get on a plane, you're not 100% sure the plane isn't going to crash. And so I think in a lot of cases, we have to decide whether to make a commitment or not. And what my work, and I'm going to talk more about all the reasons why, but a lot of what my work says is it can be rational to make that commitment, even if you're not certain, even if you have doubts. And if you continue in that commitment and doubts continue to creep up, you can still continue in that commitment rationally. I think this is true for the case of God, but also in other commitments in our life as well.
I know Pascal's wager, it's one of your favorite arguments for believing in God. Can you share for the Romanian audience what Pascal's wager is?
Yeah, this ties in very nicely to what we were just talking about, actually. So, so many arguments for God, like theistic arguments, the conclusion of them is that God exists. So one common one is like the cosmological argument. It says there is a first cause. If there's a first cause, then God exists, therefore God exists. Or we see this fine tuning of the universe. If we see this fine tuning of the universe, God exists, therefore God exists. So these are the more sort of traditional theistic arguments. And Pascal's wager is slightly different. It doesn't actually conclude that God exists. What it concludes is you should believe in God. You have a good reason to believe in God. And the reason for this, why you have a reason to believe in God, is because of the big risk involved. And in other words, you have a lot to gain if you believe in God and God exists, and you have a lot to lose if you don't believe in God and God exists. And if God doesn't exist, then it seems like believing in God or not believing in God, there's not a ton to gain or lose either way. And so the way I normally present at least the initial version of the argument is kind of what I just said. There's sort of two options. You can believe in God and not believe in God. And then two possibilities: God exists or God doesn't exist. And then, if God exists, there's a lot to gain. You could go to heaven. You could have this relationship with God. You could arguably fulfill the purpose that you were made for, which is knowing God and being in a community with others that know God as well. So there's a lot of good things you can gain if you believe in God and God exists. If you believe in God and God doesn't exist, you do have a false belief, but because God doesn't exist, then it's kind of, it's finite either way. It's kind of negligible. And then if you consider the option of not believing in God, if you don't believe in God and God exists, you could lose out on a lot. A lot of Christians believe in hell, which would be an eternal separation from God, which would be infinitely bad. It's a very serious, bad thing. But even besides that, you lose out on a relationship with God. You lose out on potentially one of the main purposes of life, to know God. So it's not a good outcome if God exists and you don't believe in God. And then, if God doesn't exist and you don't believe in God, you do get that true belief. You'll have a true belief that God doesn't exist. But again, it seems like whatever you would gain from that would be negligible compared to how good it would be or how bad it would be in the case of God existing. So that's the basic version of Pascal's wager. There are some ways that I like to try to modify the argument. I do think it gets a little more complicated than that, but that is the basic version of the wager that concludes have a reason to believe in God, that you should believe in God.
Blaise Pascal was a French mathematician, a physicist, and a religious philosopher who laid the foundation for the modern probabilities theory. He was a scientist. And Liz, I want to ask you, is faith consistent with science?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question. And I think basically the short answer is I think faith and science are definitely consistent. And I think I want to make kind of two more specific points about that. So I guess the first point is I think people often will criticize religion, kind of like what you were saying, because they're sort of making these assumptions like God exists or something, or positing a theory like God created the world. And they say, well, these aren't testable by science. We can't use science to determine whether this is true or false. So we should either ignore it, or even worse, believe it doesn't happen, But I think what's really notable here, and something I think some people might miss, is that almost every academic discipline makes these assumptions and posits these theories that we can't test with science. So there's a lot of claims and a lot of truth that goes beyond what science can tell us. Math is a huge discipline. You don't go out and do a scientific study to do math research. I lived with a lot of math grad students at Notre Dame. No, you sit in your living room, you sit at your kitchen table. I saw this happen many times with my roommates, and you do math. It's not a scientific study. It's what philosophers call a priori. It's done before experience. So you're not going out and doing a scientific study to verify your mathematical proof. It's something you verify by thinking about it. But philosophy is also like this as well. And philosophy isn't just about religion. It's not just about God. It's about ethics and morality. It's about seeing when something is right, seeing when something is wrong. It's about big questions like whether we have free will, what it is to know something. These are all questions that are not provable or testable by science. And what's interesting is that even science itself makes fundamental assumptions, and it requires these assumptions for science to even work. So I'll just say this. I don't want to go into too much of the academic stuff, but there's this thing that's called induction. Induction is basically the idea that the future is going to be like the past. And this is an assumption that is fundamental to science. That's kind of how we determine the laws of nature. We assume they're going to continue on into the future. There's been a huge philosophical discussion about this, and a lot of people like Hume are very skeptical of induction. And so scientists are just making this assumption that induction works that you can't prove with science. Even the idea that science is a good or the best means to learn about the world, that statement itself can't be proved with science. That's a philosophical statement. So the first point is just we can't get by in life without making assumptions and positing theories that aren't testable by science. Not everything is testable by science, and I think it's easy to forget that and just think science will tell us everything. But no, science does not give us all the knowledge we need. So that's the point number one that I wanted to make about this. Point number two is that I think when we're doing science and when we're studying science, the way that I like to see that is that science is giving us knowledge that complements rather than contradicts belief in God. And so what I mean by that is when we study science, when we learn about the world, when we learn about the laws of nature, we're seeing the way God created things. We're seeing the way that God set things up. And this is telling us something about God. It's telling us about God as a creator. And I also think it can be giving us evidence for God's existence. The Bible says the heavens declare the glory of God and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. And some people think you have to prove there's some miracle. There has to be a miracle to get that evidence. And I just don't think you have to. Yeah. There doesn't need to be a miracle. You can just go outside and see how beautiful a sunset is. And I think that can be evidence for God. And so I think people think it has to be this miraculous thing. And if there's not a violation of the laws of nature, we don't have evidence for God. And that I just think that's not what the Bible teaches. So again, to summarize, one, we go beyond science all the time. Science is not going to give us all the knowledge that we need anyway. But number two, when we do study science, I think it gives us evidence for God, whether or not we are positing a miracle. It's not about whether there's a miracle or not. I think science just points to a creator in and of itself.
Going back to Blaise's conversion to Christianity, I have a longer question for you. In 1646, Etienne, Blaise's father was seriously injured in a fall that resulted in a broken hip, rendering him housebound. The accident created a shift in the family's religious beliefs, as the Pascals, the family, had never fully embraced the local Christian ideas. So after Etienne's accident, he received a medical visit from two Christian brothers who influenced their life. They helped with the trauma, and they led the family to convert. So after this, Pascal became devoutly religious. And many people today start to believe in God after a shocking experience, like Blaise's case. Is faith a crutch?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think definitely not. And I think the reason I do agree that cases like what happened to Pascal are common, but I think that's because sometimes a shocking or a traumatic experience helps us look beyond just the physical world, just the things around us. It's easy, I think, when life is going well to be focused on things like money or power or these things that aren't necessarily bad in and of themselves, but can be bad if we make them our ultimate goal, you know? But when we go through something that takes one of those things away from us, I think it helps us to look beyond this world and realize this world isn't all there is. And in fact, there's actually two worlds. There's a physical world, but there's also a spiritual world. Um, and when things are great in the physical world, I think we fail to see our deeper need for these things in the spiritual world. And so faith so I think sometimes these experiences can help us expand our view of the world and see that there's things beyond this world, and in fact things that are much more satisfying, and things that, like, if we pursue them, we'll just have a much more fulfilling life. So it's actually, I don't see faith as a crutch at all. I see it, especially religious faith, as something that can point us to these, like, it can help us see what we're really made for and what's really ultimately going to satisfy us.
Liz, can you explain why Blaise Pascal came up with this argument? Explain what skeptic, if you can, explain what skeptic people believe at that time.
Yeah, definitely. So the argument appears in the Pensée. That's actually French for thoughts. And I think a lot of people really focus on the argument itself without looking kind of at the bigger context. And so one thing that I think is really important to note for this argument is that what Pascal basically does is he kind of gives arguments and narrows it down. So for him, there's basically these two live options. Either Christianity is true or there's no God at all. So a lot of people will say, "Oh, what about other religions?" You know, da 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 da. And it's really important to note that Pascal had actually argued that if a religion was true, it was Christianity. It's important to note that for Pascal, it was sort of these two options: Christianity and atheism. And what he said, which I think is very interesting, is that he said reason cannot decide between the two. And I think one way to interpret that is there is a lot of evidence for Christianity, but there is also some interesting evidence for atheism as well. And I think some people can get in a frame of mind where they could even see the possibility of either one being true. They're kind of, like you were saying, they're in this place where they like Christianity and they see some reason for it, but they also just aren't sure if does God really exist? Like, why is there so much evil in the world? You know, they still have these doubts and questions. And so I guess in general, I do think the evidence can be tough to evaluate. And there are some interesting arguments for both sides. So I think that might be kind of part of what Pascal meant when he said that reason cannot decide. But what's interesting about this is that when when reason can't decide for you, it seems like you have more of a genuine choice, and you kind of have to just take what people will call often a leap of faith. And you kind of have to just make that decision for yourself. Like at a certain point, looking at arguments isn't going to get you there. You kind of just have to decide, what are you going to commit to? And so what Pascal said is, well, look, let's look at this in terms of risk. And then he gives this argument where if Christianity is true and you follow God and you commit to God, you have so much to gain. And if Christianity is true and you decide to be an atheist, you have so much to lose. And so because of these risks, and because of how good it would be to have this relationship with God if God did exist, Pascal says you should be a Christian. You should follow Christianity. So that's, I think, kind of a little bit of background on the argument. And I think the idea that reason can't decide is controversial. I think a lot of Christian philosophers think there is actually more evidence for Christianity than atheism. But what's cool is that there's arguments we can give, even if you're at the point where you say, I don't see that evidence. I'm not to the point where I think the evidence is obviously supporting Christianity. I think there's still a good reason to make that commitment, even if you're in that situation.
Reading Pascal's thoughts, I saw that he believed in two centers. One, it's the intellectual center, and the second one is the heart center. So he was saying that sometimes when we make a decision, we take into consideration only the intellectual part. As for making a decision, for example, toward Christianity, and we don't take into consideration the heart center, what do we feel and things like that. So can you tell more about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point, and I like to think a lot about the analogy of a marriage. When you're getting married, you should think about, is this person a person I would want to marry? That should be part of the consideration. But like you said, that would be more the intellectual thing, but like you said, there's also this heart thing, it's like, are you in love with this person? Is this someone, it would be good if you spent your life with? It's not just about the evidence, it's about your desires, and so I think the decision to commit to God is like that as well. It's not just about the evidence, but it's also about, would it be good? Would it be a good thing if I committed to God and God existed? And I think for most people, yes, it would. But our desires play an important role there as well, not just kind of the evidence. So God is more pleased with someone who has very serious doubts, but still loves God and still pursues God. I think God would be more pleased with that than someone who didn't have doubts, but didn't really care, just kind of was going through the motions, but didn't have that deep love for God, or at least wasn't, didn't have those affections, So I think it's easy to really emphasize the belief side and to say, don't doubt, don't doubt, don't doubt, and ignore the fact that desiring God is also very important.
One of your papers talks about how taking Pascal's wager is closely connected to having faith. Can you tell me more about this?
Yeah, no, it's great. So I think a lot of people hear Pascal's wager and they think, that's bad motives. Why would you do that? You're just believing in God because you want to avoid hell or something, hell can be part of the thought, and the Bible talks about hell, but I don't emphasize that when I talk about it. What I talk about is how good it would be to have this relationship with God and pursue this relationship with God if God did exist. And so I think, and I actually think, I was kind of talking about, you're at this place where you're seeing the arguments for Christianity, let's say, and you're seeing the arguments for atheism, and you're really just, like Pascal said, he thinks reason can't decide. We don't even have to go that strong. You might just be in a place where you're not sure if reason's going to determine it for you, and what I think is so then I think when you're at this place where reason can't decide, I think that's where something like a leap of faith could be appropriate. And what you do is you kind of say, I'm not 100% sure Christianity is true. Maybe you'll never be 100% sure if Christianity is true. Let's be real. But maybe you're not 100% sure. Maybe you have some serious doubts, but nonetheless, you go ahead and you take that leap of faith and you take that risk because you know you have so much to gain. You have this relationship with God to gain, and you don't have that much to lose. And so when I think about this way of taking Pascal's wager, I actually think this is a totally legitimate way of demonstrating faith. You're saying, not only do I think, there's this good chance that God exists, and it would be such a good thing if God exists, but I'm willing to sort of step out and take this risk and maybe even make some really big sacrifices. And that's what I think a huge part of faith is. I think of that story in Mark where the man brings his daughter to Jesus, and he, there's a lot at stake, like his daughter's life, and he has that trust in Jesus. And then he says, I believe, but help my unbelief. And that indicates he isn't 100% sure. Maybe he's not even close to 100% sure. He has very serious doubts, but he sort of steps out in faith and takes that risk anyway because of how much he could gain if Jesus is God or Jesus can heal his daughter. And so I think when you look at Pascal's wager that way, I think it is actually very similar, very related to what it means to demonstrate faith.
Liz, can you name a couple of philosophers or scientists who started to believe in God due to this argument?
Yeah, I actually do. So I guess what I'll say first is I think I hear a lot of people that aren't professional philosophers that just say Pascal's wager is stupid. They say, why would you ever believe this? And then they give a really basic objection that philosophers have thought about for a very long time, and Pascal himself probably even thought about. And so they say, this is dumb. It's so stupid. Let's move on, But what's important to realize is I think there's been this long history starting from Pascal, but people writing on this argument, interested in this argument, like any philosophical argument. Of course, not everyone is convinced by it, but I think philosophers take it a lot more seriously than non-philosophers. So I think it's at least just worth noting that in and of itself is that it's easy to say, here's this objection and just dismiss it. But I think philosophers take it a lot more seriously. But that said, I actually have a couple personal friends that have PhDs in philosophy that either came to believe in God because of this argument. One of my friends did her PhD at NYU, and she came to believe in God from this argument. But I have other friends too that, and I think, she started off being a Christian and then just had a lot of doubts. But this argument enabled her to continue in her Christian commitment, even in the face of these doubts. And she did her PhD in philosophy at Wisconsin-Madison. So I know a couple people with PhDs in philosophy, and then many, many more that even if they didn't come to believe in God because of this argument, I think find it very convincing, or at least very interesting. They think there's something there, So yes, definitely something that philosophers take very seriously.
We spoke a little bit about this, but I want to ask you, is Pascal's wager a door to Christianity, or Christian people follow this argument in moments of doubts?
Yeah, I love this question because the answer is absolutely, totally both. I think it has both functions. So I think if you're at a place where you come to take Christianity very seriously, but you have doubts, you're still not 100% or even close to 100, you still have very serious doubts. I think Pascal's wager is a totally legitimate basis that you can make a rational commitment to God. And that's someone that this would be a door to Christianity. It's someone that wasn't a Christian before. They're starting to take Christianity seriously. And Pascal's wager can make it rational for them to sort of take that leap of faith, like we talked about. But what's cool about Pascal's wager as well, is I think it can help Christians when, they've already made this commitment to God. They made this commitment to God maybe a long time ago, maybe when they were a kid or early in life or whatever, and they go through a period where they're really struggling. And this is part of my story too. You go through a period and you're having serious doubts and you're not sure, is this true? And I think what can keep you going is realizing, if I continue in this commitment, I have so much to gain. I have this amazing relationship with God to gain. And just saying, I want this to be true. I think a lot of times people would say that's irrational, but Pascal's wager actually shows that doesn't have to be irrational, especially if you have still some evidence for Christianity. So just, continuing to pursue God because you want it to be true doesn't have to be irrational in every case. And so I think it can definitely be a reason that Christians continue in their commitment to God, even in the face of doubt. And that doesn't have to be rational. And what I've heard, irrational, I'm sorry, what I've heard people say, that's kind of this catchphrase. They say, there's the path from doubt to getting out. And what that means is, when you doubt, then you say, I can't be a genuine believer anymore. I can't genuinely go to church. I can't genuinely pray. I have to leave. I can't be a Christian anymore. And what Pascal's wager says is that that's not true. That doesn't follow. Just because you're doubting doesn't mean you have to get out, and you can continue to pursue God. You can continue to pray. You can continue to participate in your Christian community, even if you're really doubting and you're really struggling.
Liz, what about the young people who were raised in Christian families? Maybe their father is a pastor or a priest. I know it's a lot of pressure on them to live in a certain way, to have faith. Can you comment on this?
If you've just been brought up in something and you haven't thought about the other side very much, and I think I was even in situations where I didn't even really have any friends that weren't Christians for certain periods of my life. And then I think, like, once you realize that, you start to wonder, like, is this like I've just been brought up in this thing. Do I only believe it because I was brought up in this religion? I think that's a serious challenge. But yeah, I also think too, a lot of times, especially in college, like I have a friend who's a professor, and he said students would just be in his office and they would just say, I don't know if this is true. Like, I don't know if I have a good enough argument to believe this. And he's actually the one who coined that phrase, the path from doubt to getting out. And I think what is cool about Pascal's wager is it lets you freely explore those questions. You don't have to be scared of doubting. You don't have to be scared of looking at evidence for the other side or being friends with people that disagree with you. But you can do that and still continue in your commitment to God, and you still continue pursuing God and pursuing that relationship with God, but you can also still sort of follow the evidence where it leads. And I think that's really powerful. You don't have to. I think a big turning point in my life is when I stopped being scared of the evidence on the other side. I stopped freaking out whenever I would realize, like, this person's an atheist or this smart person is an atheist. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. Pascal's wager is one reason, but also just knowing, and I think it's important for lots of people to know, there are Christian academics out there. There are Christian philosophers out there that take the Bible seriously and take Jesus seriously and think Jesus rose from the dead, but also have thought through these things and have good answers and have good responses. And I think knowing a lot of these people personally has also been huge for me. I think it's easy to, again, because we're in these academic journals and all this stuff, people don't always know that these people exist, but they do. So I think for me, that was a big part as well.
So, Liz, many people focus on here and now. And in our previous discussion, when we talk about this interview, you said that it's almost not rational to be thinking about the here and now. And tell me why. Isn't this statement arrogant?
The issue, there's a name for it. It's called time bias. And I don't want to, again, I'm not trying to get into all these academic words necessarily, but here's a really basic experiment they did that shows that people are often time biased. And that means you're focusing more on maybe what's going to happen to you sooner rather than what's going to happen to you later. And so what they did is they got children in, a lot of children, and they said these children really loved marshmallows. I think that's a thing you have in Romania, like the little candies. And so they said, you can either have one marshmallow right now, or you have to wait. I think it was like maybe 15 minutes or 30 minutes, something, not a very long time, but enough time. You have to wait. And if you wait, you get 2 marshmallows. And it was very interesting to see which of these children had took the 1 marshmallow right now, and which of these children waited to get the 2 marshmallows later. And what I think a lot of people think experiments like this show, if you want marshmallows, it seems like what you should do, what's rational for you to do, is wait for the 2 marshmallows. But not all of the children did that. A lot of the children just took the 1 marshmallow now, And one thing that is true about human nature is that I think it's easy to want something right away, immediately, rather than sort of waiting for something even better in the future. And that's what's called time bias. And I think the idea that we shouldn't care more about the immediate future than we care about the future in a while, that explains why it's rational to do things like save for retirement or brush your teeth when you really don't feel like it, So even though it's human nature to focus on the here and now, I think what we should try to do is catch ourselves when we're focusing too much on the here and now and not thinking about, well, what implications is this going to have for me in 10 years or in 20 years or, further down the road. And I want to talk a little bit about how this relates to Pascal's wager. So some people might say, well, Pascal's wager, that's like about this like heaven thing that's so far away. Like, I don't even know if that exists. And then that'll not even be until when I die. Like what? Why should I care about Pascal's wager? And I just want to have fun now. I don't want to commit my life to God. That sounds boring, And so I think there's 2 things to say. I mean, the first thing to say is you can think about it like a marshmallow experiment. Are you going to take the 1 marshmallow now? Or in this case, it's like hundreds of marshmallows later. And it's like the marshmallow experiment shows it is totally understandable that people want the marshmallow now. That is human nature. You want that 1 marshmallow now. But if you can focus on that future reward, things are going to be so much better for you. Things like your life is going to turn out better. And even there's psychological studies that show when you have something good in the future, that makes right now better too, because you're looking forward to that thing. So that's the first thing to say. But I think the second thing to say, I'm going to send you an article and maybe you can link it in the show notes as well. There's a philosopher, his name is Justin McBrayer. He's a Christian philosopher. He teaches in Colorado. And he has an article where what he argues is there's a lot of really, really interesting evidence that practicing a religion or being a Christian, it's not just about heaven. It's not just about this thing that's very far away, but Christians are happier in studies, healthier, less likely to get divorced, like psychologically healthier. There's so much interesting evidence. I put a few of the things. So the happiness, so there's Gallup polls that show that spiritual commitment is correlated with life satisfaction, and those who are highly spiritually committed are more than twice as likely to be happy than those who describe themselves as uncommitted. Then what they did is they did what's called a meta-analysis, where they take a bunch of studies and then look at what all those studies show together. So they looked at 100 studies, and more than 80% of them indicated that there was a positive correlation between religion and well-being. So they said religion can provide a new vision that transformed a life racked with doubt, contradiction, and despair into one of purpose, commitment, and joy. And then again, there was mental and physical health associated with religion. Another meta-analysis showed that religious people live longer than non-religious people. They're more likely to be satisfied in interpersonal relationships, less likely to be divorced. They're more likely to give to charitable causes, both religious and non-religious. And this is just a couple of the things. So that was just a few bullet points of the summaries. But there's this article I mentioned. It's called The Wager Renewed. And so I highly recommend go look at that. And so what that shows is that, let's go back to the marshmallow thing. When you take Pascal's wager, you're not just getting 10 marshmallows or 20 marshmallows later. You're actually getting extra marshmallows now too, if that article is right. And you might not realize that at first. You might not see it. You might not believe it. But actually, practicing a religion and committing to God is better in this life and in the next life. So I would highly recommend people go look at that article. It's not a very technical academic. It's understandable for more people. So I would encourage, if you're interested, you should go look at it.
Liz, let's just say that young people are waiting for those 100 marshmallows. But is there something that they lose by not taking the first marshmallow?
What I'm not saying is that there's nothing that you're going to lose that you might enjoy right now by committing to God. The Bible talks about that. There is a cost associated with it, but what you gain is so much more than what you lose. It's so easy just to focus on what you lose. I guess it's my duty, da 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 da. And I want to say no, that doesn't have to be the focus. Think about this amazing thing that you're gaining. That should be your focus, and that should be your motivation. And ultimately that's a relationship with God. But not only that, like I said, there's all these other benefits that come along with that as well. So it's not, it's a here and now thing, and it's a future thing.
Liz, was great to have this conversation with you. And if you have just one more thought, one more idea that you want to share with the Romanian audience, please let us know. We are here listening.
Yeah, that's a good question. What is the last thing I want people to leave here with? I guess when I'm thinking about kind of this interview and the two things that stuck out to me, I think the first is what I would say is that God wants commitment, not certainty. I think it's really easy to think that it's just the ideal, the best thing, what we should all be striving for is just to be as certain as possible that God exists. But I think what's more important is that you take that leap of faith and you have that genuine commitment. So that's how I've put it before, is I think God wants commitment, not certainty. That's the first thing. And then I think the second thing is just knowing, I think when I was in college, it would have been so helpful for me to know that there are Christians that are dealing with these big questions and wrestling with them and coming up with answers. And we haven't had time to go into all of that here in this interview, but I think I wasn't fully aware of everything that's going on in Christian philosophy. But I just want people to know that there are Christians that are serious academics that are thinking through these and do have answers. And I encourage you to seek those out. And if you can't figure out where to find something, you can even email me. And I would be happy to point you in the direction. But there is a lot of new resources coming up on like YouTube. And I think a lot of what I love about places like YouTube is that it's a platform that I think a lot of Christian philosophers can make their work more accessible to a public audience. So I guess I just want to kind of leave the listener with those 2 points.